going to get. Okay, my name is Janet Forrest. I work at the Nantucket Atheneum in the Delta Programs Department, along with Daniel Griffin. And today we have a conversation with Robert Dallek and Peter Panchy. Peter Panchy has taught history at Nantucket High School for more than 30 years. In addition to it, he also works at the Atheneum with Daniel and I. And he has also taught college at the graduate and undergraduate levels. He has a BA from Harvard and a Master's of Education from Lesley University. Robert Dallek, who we'll be hearing from tonight, he is, in addition to being the author of How Did We Get Here, he's also the author of An Unfinished Life, John F. Kennedy, and Nixon and Kissinger. So without any further ado, I'm going to pass it along to Peter and Robert and enjoy the conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Janet. Hi, Robert, or Bob. You prefer Bob, I think I remember.
Either one is fine.
Okay. As I mentioned yesterday, the first thing I'd like to ask after I say, I wanted to hold up your books. If we can't see you, people could at least see your book. I'm an admirer who's read several of your books. And my first question was, what was your motivation that got you to write this particular book?
Well, you know, I was surprised that Donald Trump won the election in 2016 because he was someone who had never served in any public capacity before. Now, there have been presidents who, when they became president, they were running for the first time for elected office. But they had a background of experience in public office. William Howard Taft, for example, who became president in the early part of the 20th century, and he had been Governor General of the Philippines. He had been Theodore Roosevelt's Secretary of War, but he had never run for office before. There are others who demonstrated that as well. But what makes Trump unusual is that he had never run for anything. He had never served in public office. And he was, in that sense, a total novice. And so I was puzzled by why people would put someone in the White House who had never served in public office or run for anything in the past. I think part of the answer that I found was that people in American politics, they like something fresh, something new, something different from what had come before, except when there is a period of turmoil and disconnection, so to speak, like in 1968, when the Vietnam War had created chaos in the United States. And there was, I'm sure you will remember, turmoil at the Democratic Convention in Chicago. And what was amazing that year is that it was a presidential election year, and the two candidates were Richard Nixon and Hubert Humphrey. And you couldn't find two more familiar political faces in Washington in 1968. And the puzzle was, for me, why put these two candidates up if you've had so much turmoil? And it was because they wanted some kind of continuity, you see. And when Trump ran in 2016, the point is there wasn't turmoil, there wasn't some kind of disconnection in the society. But, and here I'll go out on a limb and say that I think this time around in 2020, he will lose because the country now is back in that mood that it wants some sense of continuity. And of course, no one fits the bill better than Joe Biden.
You do mention continuity in your book in several places, Bob. And one of the things with the changes in our current politics about kind of the demonization of the opponent or the other party, do you think that this presidency is creating a real break in that sense of continuity from one administration to another? Bob, can you hear me?
Now I hear you.
Did you hear what I had asked about? Has the Trump presidency kind of broken the sense of continuity from one administration to another?
Yes, I think the sense of continuity from one administration to another has largely been broken with Donald Trump's administration. And of course, first of all, he demonstrated a antagonism to the former president, Barack Obama, and he wasn't running against Obama, but in many ways, he made him the whipping boy for that 2016 election. And of course, in a sense, the problem in 2016 was that Hillary Clinton was old news, that people had remembered that Bill Clinton, her husband, had served for 8 years in the White House. And this was a moment when the country, I think, very much wanted something different, something new. And that certainly was Donald Trump, because he was not familiar the way Hillary Clinton and the Clintons in general were, or Barack Obama was. And so it gave Trump an advantage in 2016.
Something you mentioned throughout your scan of the 20th century presidents from Teddy Roosevelt right up to George H.W. Bush, starting off with Teddy Roosevelt, you emphasize his mastery of using the press.
Yes.
And throughout the 20th century, that use of media is mentioned by you a lot. FDR with his radio chats, both Nixon with his checkers speech, and then later JFK in the debates, right up through Ronald Reagan. And certainly,
Yes.
With Reagan and Trump, you point out that they're both kind of veterans of the entertainment business,
Right.
and are even more skilled at presenting a finished product of sorts. If you could address that change in the use of media throughout the presidency, and then later, Trump's use of a new tool, the tweeting, that kind of cuts through having to go through professional media.
Yeah, exactly right. That what you have in the 20th century is the command provided by these electronic developments. That first, of course, it's radio, where Franklin Roosevelt was masterful at using that. And then with John Kennedy, it became television. And people remembered the first debate between Kennedy and Nixon, in which they don't remember much of what was said between the two of them. But what they recall is that Kennedy looked presidential, and he was a handsome young man, and that Nixon was a familiar character, but Kennedy represented something new, and he used what was new, you see. And we've even come a long way from the initial use of television to a time when you have televised debates in presidential elections, which of course is unprecedented from the way presidential elections were conducted in the past. And now you even have the internet. As you mentioned, this whole idea that you can tweet and millions of people are going to get your message. You see, that what it suggests is that Donald Trump is very much a modern man. But I think in this current election, what's most appealing to people is continuity with our democratic traditions, and that they're not so eager this time around to have something new. And so, in that sense, Biden fills the bill of the moment, and that people want to have a sense of continuity, a sense that our democracy, our democratic institutions are being preserved. And so skilled politicians have to understand what the current social climate is about if they're going to win backing from a majority of voters.
You also address, as much as you talk about the president's use of media and now technology, you also do address kind of the demonization of the press that's gone far beyond Richard Nixon's enemies list to phrases like enemy of the people, traitors. Do you want to comment on that?
Robert, are you there?
We lose him.
Oh, he's there.
Janet, I see you.
Were you able to hear my question, Bob?
No, you sounded like you were speaking Chinese.
Okay, well, that's not one of my gifts. I'll try again.
No, I couldn't. You were breaking up. I couldn't understand your last.
Okay, what I was saying was that beyond talking about how presidents use the press and the media, you also, in several places, talked about Trump's attitudes toward the press,
Yes,
far exceeding Nixon's famous enemies list, to
yes.
condemning them totally as enemies of the people and fake news. Do you care to comment on where that takes us?
Well, it seems to me it's a terribly anti-democratic statement because the press is now, of course, a very broad industry. We're not just talking about newspapers and headlines, but we're talking about all these electronic devices that allow people to communicate with not just other people, but hear from politicians. And in a way, I think Trump makes a terrible mistake when he says that the press, the news media, are the enemies of the people. Now, of course, there are numerous people who believe him, but I'm not so surprised, because what I think back to is that I'm trying to remember the date, when Richard Nixon left office in 1974, he still had 25% approval, despite the fact that he was a defeated, abandoned, unprecedented, ousted president, you see. So the fact that some 40 or 42% of people in this country are supporting Trump, despite his 4-year administration now, which can hardly be described as one of the great presidencies of American history or of modern American history. And I think it speaks to his insensitivity to winning majority support. Indeed, what's so striking to me is that Trump has never achieved 50% approval in his going on 4 years in the White House. And that's unprecedented for a president in a first term. Franklin Roosevelt never went below 50% except once in 1944. But Trump has never reached 50%. And I think it's a very bad sign for him. On the other hand, he wasn't 50% or above when he won the election in 2016.
Yep.
And so it may be that he's hoping that he can pull off the same surprise. But I tend to doubt it.
You make contrasts and comparisons to many of the presidents of the 20th century.
Yes.
I was struck on a couple of occasions when you talked about Harry Truman on the issues of responsibility, you know, his statement that the buck stops here.
Right.
This came up again when you spoke about the way John F. Kennedy took responsibility for the Bay of Pigs fiasco.
Yes.
Certainly, you characterize Trump as different, in greatly different, almost an antithesis.
Yes. But, you know, he still wins the backing of millions of people in the country. Mm-hmm. And to me, it's a puzzle. And I wonder, do they know anything about presidential history? Yeah. I don't think Trump does, because when he says he's done more for African Americans than any president in history, except maybe for Lincoln. And even Lincoln, he has some qualifications about. But does he know what Lyndon Johnson did with the civil rights, voting rights, housing rights bills? I doubt it, because how could he say that if he knew anything about Johnson's record in civil rights?
Yeah, and you brought up Johnson in another way that really struck me, talking about the issue of unity, and that even when Johnson was pushing civil rights as a Southerner, he really believed that getting rid of segregation in the South would be a major step to reintegrating the South into a unified United States. I thought that was a tremendously interesting perspective that certainly seems absent today.
Without question, I couldn't agree more in that Trump seems to cater to certain conservative or right-wing voters, and seems to dismiss people who are critical of him. And I think it's so unprecedented because once you become president, you're president not just of the people who voted for you, but of the United States of America. And I think this is going to contribute to his defeat in 2020. Now, after the election is over, you should have me back so that we can talk about whether I have egg on my face.
Well, I'd be delighted to talk with you again. I think we could probably arrange that.
Okay.
Another thought I had, and you just brought it up, is the way really uncharacteristic, not only of our president, but our system, that when somebody criticizes the president, it has now become the basis for an attack on that person. Can democracy really function when I'm always right and you're always wrong? I'm a patriot, you're a traitor.
Right. Not your point is so well taken. It really is so destructive to our democracy. And in fact, what I've been saying is that I fear that Trump is undermining the viability of the Republican Party. And we need a robust, healthy two-party system. And of course, there are times when one party or the other takes a substantial beating, and yet they recover, you see. Franklin Roosevelt winning 4 elections in a row, but then in 1948, the Republicans are favored to beat Harry Truman. And of course, Truman does win, but in 52, the Republicans come up with a very popular candidate at a time when public personality counts a great deal in Dwight Eisenhower. And so they're able to win 2 elections in a row. So what makes the country's democracy work and be healthy, so to speak, is a continuity of 2 parties in contest with each other. No single party, no single personality, no authoritarianism, so to speak. And it's, for the moment, waning. But I'm confident that given the track record of the United States, that we will make a comeback with a more democratic, robust, with a small d, democratic system.
Yeah, something else you mentioned about Eisenhower, you just brought up Eisenhower, is when you were talking about his use of federal force for civil rights in the South. His standpoint, even as a moderate to conservative Republican, was he was doing that to enforce the rule of law.
Exactly.
Whereas, again, you imply a tremendous contrast with the way those phrases and actions are being taken today.
Yes, indeed. Because Eisenhower, in representing what the will of the courts, because the courts had insisted on public school integration. And Orval Forbes, the governor of Arkansas, was resisting that. And Eisenhower sent in troops to assure that the will of the Supreme Court was enforced, you see. And so the rule of law was what counted. And Eisenhower understood that. And he was a a voice of continuity in our democratic system. And it's essential. It's very important that that rule of law stand, because if it disappears, then we are slipping into the kind of uh, authoritarian government that you have in Russia, that you got in Italy and Germany in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, and it's counts for everything.
Well, you certainly don't use the word fascism, but as you describe some of the characteristics of the Trump administration, I think that word is being applied by some. And what do you think of that, Bob?
Well, I think it's better to make a substantive argument instead of using a phrase or a word that is so overcharged. I mean,
Mhm.
you know, you call somebody a fascist, it's really like a curse word at this
Yeah.
point, given the history of the 30s and 40s and World War II, and then Stalinism and Soviet communism. So it's better, I think, if you make, now, it's true, catchphrases are enormously important in the sense that uh, Theodore Roosevelt captures the public imagination with the new nationalism, and Wilson with the new freedom, FDR with the New Deal, see, and Truman calls his administration the Fair Deal, and then Johnson with the Great Society, Kennedy with the New Frontier, and it's very important in a mass society, mass democratic society like this, to provide some coherent phrase. Uh, Frankly, I had dinner 5 times with President Obama because he liked to talk to presidential historians. And I wasn't the only one. I don't mean to suggest that I was just there. There were 7 or 8 presidential historians that he invited to have dinner with him at the White House. And he speculated on the possibility of calling his administration the new foundation, but it never quite took hold.
Yeah, that's something you do mention, and I think if I misquote you, please disagree. But I think you're talking about how those slogans implied a going forward and a vision, whereas with Harding's, back to normalcy kind of issue and make America great again, it's more a sense of loss.
That's right. That's right. A sense of going back, of recapturing something that has been uh, uh, tossed aside or lost. And you're right. That's not a great idea. People want to hear about something more robust and more promising because Americans are generally optimistic and they want to believe that there's a better future. And that is the job of a political leader to encourage that and to convince them that that leader represents a better time. And so making America great again is you're recapturing something from the past, or as you said, with Harding and normalcy. So there is a moment when people may find that appealing, but I don't think it lasts. And I think it's a losing way of approaching politics.
Throughout your review of the presidents, you talk about the expansion of executive power.
Yeah.
That's been going on throughout the 20th and into the 21st. Any comments on that development of, for lack of a better word, the imperial presidency and how it leads to Trump's pushing that envelope as well?
Well, you're absolutely right that Arthur Schlesinger, the great historian, brought forward that phrase, the imperial presidency, because with the rise of industrial America and the need for executive leadership to manage the kinds of economic and social problems that emerged with an industrialized society which came into existence in the late 19th century. And it gave, for the first time, a kind of power to the executive, which had really not been there, at least since Abraham Lincoln, when he commanded the United States in the struggle over the Civil War. But the presidents of the late 19th century fade into the woodwork because they're in the shadow of Lincoln. And it's not until Theodore Roosevelt that you begin to see the centralization and the expansion of presidential power once again. And this is now with Theodore Roosevelt and then with Woodrow Wilson. This is now something which has become a major part of the executive branch. And of course, it slides back as it did with Warren G. Harding or with Calvin Coolidge. But when Herbert Hoover failed to meet the dangers of the Great Depression and the dislocations of that economic collapse, Franklin Roosevelt was a new voice. And when he said this country demands action and action now, it had to come not so much from the Congress, but from the executive. And small wonder then that you get Eisenhower, a military leader who played a major role in winning World War II. You see, that people want an authority figure, a strong executive, a leader in that sense. Because in the late 19th century, it was the Congress which really had much more authority and influence with the public than any president did. In fact, if you went out in the street and asked people who was Chester Arthur, or someone like that, they wouldn't have a clue.
Right. A point that you made that struck me when you were talking about Reagan and that how he said government is the problem,
Right.
and how that undercut contingency planning and capability. And I couldn't but think of our government's reaction during the COVID crisis.
Yes, exactly. And I'm thinking of writing a book now called Why Government? And it would be about the fact that in this modern industrial and communications age, there's a need for government leadership. And so you get all these programs like the GI Bill of Rights or Social Security or Medicare and Medicaid or the Obama health care or the civil rights and voting rights and housing rights bills. I mean, the government has done extraordinary things. And the FCC and the Securities and Exchange Commission, all these entities that have modernized and served, I think, American well-being.
I'm only going to ask a couple other quick questions because I think some of our participants would also like to direct a few questions at you, Bob. But one quick one I had when you were talking about how Nixon and his campaign reached out to the North Vietnamese during the election in '68, basically, if I can paraphrase, saying, if you wait for me to become president, you'll get a better deal.
Right.
Do you think those actions of that type laid the precedent or groundwork for the Trump campaign looking to Russia for assistance?
No, I think that there is some special connection between the Kremlin and Trump, and in particular with the leadership of Russia now, that Putin, that they have some kind of hold on him. I'm not sure whether it's videotapes or it has to do with money and business dealings. I don't know what it is, but it's transparent that he has some kind of connection to Putin that gives the Russians a kind of influence which they've never had before.
I see it much the same way. And here's my last question, and then I'm going to turn it over to Janet. The use of pardons. I think of Ford, who basically fell on his sword to pardon Nixon.
Yes.
And as we look back on that, in many ways, for the health and resuscitation of the country. But then we look at the George H.W. Bush pardons of the Iran-Contra, for lack of a better word, criminals. Does that create a precedent that Trump or maybe some of those around him use to justify some of his pardons that have been so controversial?
Yes. Well, this is a controversial administration because there have been so many people around Trump. It's really amazing as to the number of people who have gotten into trouble with law enforcement and either are convicted or under scrutiny for misdeeds. And that's going to be one of the things that historians will probe and remember about this Trump presidency. It's not positive, it's not flattering at all, but it is a reality of the indifference or lawlessness that this administration has demonstrated. But I think it only has so much ability to strike positive notes and reach people, and they want to believe that their government and their president in particular is a believer in the rule of law.
Well, Bob, it's been a pleasure talking with you. And I just want to say the conversation's been stimulating, just as your book, How Did We Get Here, is. I enjoyed reading it very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
So we have a question. Anyone else that has questions, go ahead and click that Q&A button and put it in there. The first question is from someone named Scott, and he asked, he says, it is being reported today that POTUS told the people of North Carolina to vote twice, once by mail and then in person, apparently to test the system. What do you think of that?
What can I say? It's idiocy. I mean, to suggest people should vote twice. I mean, it's nonsense. Who would ever suggest that? Who knows anything about the American political system? It's just impermissible. And all it will do, I think, is further undermine Trump's standing with the larger public.
Okay. We have another question from Charlie. Please tell us your thoughts on the Electoral College.
Well, it may well be outdated because it's very frustrating to people when they are voting in the majority and then their candidate loses despite the fact that he's had majority support because of the Electoral College. And so I think that it's time for us to consider an amendment to the Constitution that would make our elections strictly by popular vote. But of course, the founding fathers put that in the Constitution because they didn't want to see the tyranny of the majority, as it subsequently was stated.
Okay. The next question is from Joseph. Has there ever been a time in history where there was a real concern that the president would not accept the results of the election? We actually have two questions. A similar one, is there any concern about Trump refusing to leave office if he loses in November?
Well, without question, there's concern because this is a man who any psychiatrist could tell you is a malignant narcissist, and he cannot stand to be defeated or to be told he's second best. He's got to be on top. He's got to be the winner. And that's what he's trying to do. And there's lots of concern now that he will refuse to accept his defeat if it comes in November 2020. And so this is a problem for the country. And that, all these people who run for president are narcissists. After all, who would want to subject themselves to that kind of criticism and public attack? And but their desire to be thought of as great men, you see, as extraordinary, is so compelling that they're willing to take the risks. And I guess there's something positive in that. We wouldn't want to have somebody running for president who was a wallflower, but it's really overdone with Trump, one might say.
Sorry, I'm here. As a follow-up to that question, they want to know, has it ever happened before, not accepting the election?
No. I mean, we've had, of course, disputed elections in the 19th century. And at one point, we had to have a commission that was set up to decide the outcome. And of course, more recently, in that Bush-Gore election, the Supreme Court had to decide what to do about Florida, and really stepped in to decide the election. So it's not unheard of that these elections are going to have to be adjudicated because of the result, which is not decisive. But whenever there has been any kind of decisiveness in an election, the losing candidate always accepts it as a recognition that this is the American democratic procedure. And if you try to go against it, you're going to undermine the continuity of America's institutions and you're not going to succeed, because the public, a majority of the public, will not sit still for it.
Mhm. We have a question from Deborah. Have any presidents in the past had a foreign power interfere in their election?
Well, they may have thought that, but we've never had a president who was so beholden to a foreign government that they were going to let that government or that head of state shape the outcome of one of our elections. Indeed, the founding fathers were profoundly disturbed at the thought that there would be foreign interference from France or Britain to manipulate and control our election. And it's just something that is outside the bounds of acceptability in our democratic tradition.
Let's see, we had one just come in. It seems like many of the outrageous things Trump is doing as president are not actually against the law, but he is simply defying the norms of his office. Do you feel that because of the Trump presidency, some new laws should be introduced to prevent this from happening again?
Well, I'm not a lawyer, and I'm no expert on constitutional law, but I would leave that to scholars of with a legalistic background to see what might be introduced to assure against changes or actions that undermine our democratic tradition.
Okay.
If you have
Yes.
time, I have something I wanted to get Bob's comment on that I didn't ask. Again, one of the presidents you contrast with is Carter, who certainly didn't have as many successes in his presidency as he would have wished. But you point out the morality of the Carter presidency. And on page 185, you report that Carter says to the Shah, a quote from an Iranian poet that says, "If the misery of others leave you indifferent and with no feeling of sorrow, then you cannot be called a human being."
Yes.
My opinion was that you said that with a purpose there.
Yes, I mean that the point is that however in some ways weak a politician Jimmy Carter was, he was a fine human being. And, you know, I think historians will remember him as much, if not more, for his post-presidential period of service to the country. And I think, you know, this idea that you have, and people like that, you know, they want to think that a president has been elevated, he's sort of on a pedestal, and he should be a man with moral standing. And so that's why someone like John Kennedy loses some ground, because of all the stories about his womanizing and extramarital relations, and however appealing it may be to male readers about Kennedy's life, it's not something which conforms with a larger appreciation of his behavior.
We have another question from another Bob. Why are almost all Republicans not willing to confront his outrageous comments, which they know are lies?
Well, because their politics takes precedent over decency. I mean, you know, if there's a Democratic politician with a capital D, who lies and is corrupt, then I would hope party loyalists would throw him out, want to get rid of him. Look what happened with Lyndon Johnson. He was, of course, a dyed-in-the-wool Democrat, capital D, and had run as a Democrat, had always been a Democrat, and he couldn't run again in '68 because people saw him. Remember, there was what was known as the credibility gap. And the joke went around, how do you know when LBJ is telling the truth? When he pulls his earlobe, scratches his chin, he's telling the truth. When he begins to move his lips, he's lying. And it was very destructive to him because credibility, trustworthiness is an essential ingredient of presidential leadership, or so I believe.
We do have another question. Peter, do you have a comment?
Yeah, again, jumping off on this idea that maintaining political power now dominates all. And it seems as though we've seen a tremendous amount where the presidency was used continuously to campaign for re-election. If that continues, when does the energy, or when can the energy go to actually governing and doing the job of the presidency?
Well, Peter, when people are more mindful of what you just said, they are going to be eager to see a president who is presidential, who stands above the partisanship and the petty politics, so to speak. Now, there's always going to be opposition, which is fine. You're not going to have someone with 100% support from all elements, but people also, they don't like politicians, they don't like politics, and so someone comes along who presents himself as above politics, so to speak, as in a sense Trump did. And that strikes resonant chords with people. Of course, as he's been in office, I think millions of people understand that was nonsense, as this business that people should vote twice. I mean, it's just absurd.
Okay, we have one more question. I think we'll wrap up. This one is from Rena. Have any past presidents used even a small amount of tactics to divide the nation to gain advantage?
Well, there is some of that. Richard Nixon did some of that. And of course, before the Civil War, there was a lot of that because there was bitter divide between the North and the South, northern states and southern states. But by and large, presidents try not to do that because if they're running for a second term, and then when they're in a second term, they know they're very mindful of what historians will say about them, you see. And I enjoy that in the sense that I'm a historian, and can I influence these presidents? Well, not while they're in office, but they want you to be friendly and positive about them. But of course, we're not always that way by any means.
Okay, well, thank you, Peter. Thank you, Bob. This was really a great conversation, and we wish you well.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Peter. Thank you, Janet.
Oh, thank you for a delightful conversation and for sharing your ideas and insights with us, Bob. I enjoyed it tremendously.
And Peter, will you hold up his book one more time? I'm sure Bookworks and Mitchell's has it if you want to shop locally. And I'll double check. I believe the library will probably have a copy in their collection.
Good,
You can get it
good,
from us.
good. Well, both of you stay well. And that virus is hunting all of us. But
Thank you, Bob. You stay well as
yes,
you.
yes. Thank
Thanks,
you.
Bob. You have a wonderful night. Good night.
Thank you. Bye-bye.